All right, so first of all, thank you all for joining me today for this webinar. Today we're going to be looking at language learning in school, as well as bilingualism and language learning software that can help facilitate your language programs at your school. My name is Mark Phillip, and I'm an application engineer with Studica Incorporated, and I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues. Specifically Christy Leitner, the director of our marketing. Like I said, she'll be able to help field any technical issues you might have through the chat. Studica is an academic reseller. We do a lot of software and hardware sales to schools and public schools, K through 12, higher education, universities, as well as private schools all across North America. We also have offices internationally as well, and we've been doing this for over 30 years, so we have a lot of expertise and knowledge in the educational sector. And today we'll be looking at the Babbel language platform and kind of what it can bring to your language program at school. My contact info is right here on this slide, as well as the URL for our website. So if you want to take a look at what we have on our website, feel free to do that. And with that, I'll jump into it. So the first thing I'm going to jump into and talk about is basically the importance of language learning, or why it matters for your students and why it matters for schools to start teaching this or to increasingly teach this even more. Some of the topics I'll hit on are the phenomenon of student diversity increasing in North America, specifically the United States. We'll also look at language requirements at the collegiate level and what that means for K-12 schools and colleges as well. We'll also talk about the trend of globalization and what that means for your students moving into the future as the global market expands and becomes bigger and bigger. And basically, why is that facilitating language learning, or why does that make language learning more necessary than before? And the last point here that I'm going to mention here briefly, but not really elaborate on, is about health and well-being. A quick point about language learning is that usually the goal with language learning is to help reinforce bilingualism, or to try and get somebody to learn another language. And study after study by many linguists and psychologists have shown that bilingual individuals have what's known as better executive control. And executive control deals with your attention span, your problem-solving skills, and your ability to adapt to new information. And generally what's seen is that bilingual individuals are better at all of these things when compared to monolingual individuals, and these benefits actually last well into your twilight years, showing a later onset of Alzheimer's disease as well as dementia in older people who are bilingual. I'm not going to dive into these studies too much, but there's a lot of really interesting information and studies that have been done by a lot of professionals at many universities, and I'd encourage you, if you're interested in the subject, to look into that. So the first topic is about the trend of student diversity increasing in the United States. And I say student diversity, but realistically it's diversity across the spectrum. It's not just students. What we see from the Pew Research Center is that there's a projection that by 2065, the clear majority is going to be made up of a combination of what are currently minority demographics. And this is going to increase the desire for other people to be learning multiple languages, largely due to the variety of language that we're going to see propping up within the next 20, 30 years. It's going to drive that demand, and it's going to create basically a business environment and educational environment where being bilingual is going to be favorable and is going to be advantageous. So it's important for students to start learning now to be able to adapt to this changing demographic that we're seeing in the United States and really all across the world. Another point about why language learning is important is that the Modern Language Association had done a study that looked at pretty much most of the universities across the United States. They found approximately 50% of higher education institutions nowadays have a language requirement. That means that you have to take some sort of language course to actually get a degree at 50% of the schools in the US, and there's indications that just this trend is actually going to increase, that we're going to see even more schools start to implement such requirements. So what's this mean for, say, K-12 schools, right? I mean, a big part of K-12 is preparing students for higher education, for their academic life, right? And you can better prepare your students to actually go into, higher education with this knowledge of a second language, if you start teaching them earlier. And it's going to be easier for them to take these courses and adapt to it and retain that information if you start them earlier. Many studies have shown that, younger children adapt to new languages much quicker than older people do. They don't know why exactly, but that's been shown time and time again. At the college level, what professors and, administrators need to be thinking about is how can we deliver, a comprehensive language education for cheap, because of the student debt crisis and the increasing cost of college. A big part of, what's on the minds of these administrators at higher education institutions is how can I do this for, cheap and make it beneficial for my students at the same time. And this chart that we see right here is the percent of institutions that have developed international or global learning outcomes. International global learning outcomes basically means like a foreign language, course. And what we see from 2006 to 2011, and I believe current data is being compiled currently about this, but between 2006 and 2011, we've seen at least a 10% increase across the board for all types of degrees at the college level, a 10% increase in how many schools are requiring basically a foreign language course. And again, this is across every degree, your doctoral, your master's, bachelorette, associate. You have to, at this point, for 50% of the schools in the country at least, you have to have some kind of language requirement. Another point about the benefit of language learning for your students is globalization job prospects. Now, first of all, I want to kind of define globalization because some people may not be familiar with the term. It's kind of a buzzword that shows up in the media a lot. But essentially, globalization refers to this notion of a global economy and the idea that borders are sort of shrinking and becoming almost non-existent because of the information era. So the fact that we can all communicate instantaneously across the world is basically opening up communication and businesses that would never have existed 20, 30 years ago. And this phenomena is driving an enormous amount of economic growth all across the world, especially in emerging economies that are currently undergoing like a modern industrial revolution. And because of this phenomenon, we're seeing a huge increase of companies, specifically a lot of Fortune 500 corporations, who are looking for individuals who are bilingual or who know a language so that those individuals can communicate with people in this emerging economy and understand their cultural norms and traditions and be able to navigate that landscape effectively. This graph that we see at the top is from the Burning Glass Technologies Labor Insight. I believe I pulled this from the Department of Labor, if I remember correctly. The number of online job listings for workers with bilingual skills, the difference between 2010 to 2015. And it's pretty astonishing, actually. Within 5 years, we've seen over double the amount of job listings, essentially, for bilingual employees. I do want to note that this data could also be suggesting some other phenomenon, such as within 5 years, it could be possible that there's just more people connected to the internet, so the job postings went up. But I don't think that would account for over a twofold increase. I think overall, we're just seeing that the demand is increasing rapidly as emerging economies are also booming. What's interesting about this is that the demand is spread across every type of job. It's not just low-wage workers or blue-collar work. We're actually seeing it in the white-collar sectors or higher-wage sectors as well. And some of these charts will kind of shed some light on this. The figure on the left, what we see from the same source, is that we're still looking at the period of 2010 to 2015, but we're looking at the percentage, the change in share of jobs targeting bilingual workers. And we're looking at the prestige levels of the job itself. And prestige is basically a measurement of how people perceive the prestigiousness of a certain occupation. So for an example, your lowest prestige might be like a custodian or a fast food worker generally. And your higher prestiges are going to be your surgeons and doctors, right? And what we see is that there's a big increase in demand for bilingual workers all across the board and all those prestiges, and specifically in the high prestige, which is kind of counter to what a lot of people think. A lot of people assume that this demand is being driven in low wage work. That basically, think a lot of farm laborers are maybe Spanish speaking, right? And people think that, well, since there's such a big demand for farm laborers, of course, low wage workers then are going to be needing more bilingual work, but that's actually not the case. We're seeing the high prestige with the sharpest spike, and this is kind of correlates with the graph we see on the right, which is the employers with the largest share of bilingual listings as of 2015. You'll notice a lot of these companies, they're Fortune 500 corporations, they're banks, insurance companies, and data carriers. And so this is where you're also seeing a lot of demand in your high prestige, right? Because banks are looking to do business overseas now. They're looking to tap into these emerging markets and take their investments and make interest off of them. Your data carriers are trying to expand their LTE networks and make 5G networks and things like that in new and emerging countries and economies. So this demand is massive, and it's in really good jobs too. It's not just custodial work or fast food labor, right, where they need more bilingual workers. I mean, banks and doctors and surgeons, like these people are increasingly their qualifications, if you're bilingual, it's looking better and better. And this is just part of the trend of globalization. As more and more emerging economies come out and the borders, so to speak, start shrinking, we see a lot more intermingling there and a lot more business being done where you need people who know the language and who can navigate those cultural norms. And so setting up your students with a comprehensive language learning program will help ensure them success in their professional lives as well as their academic lives. That's kind of the upshot of these slides here. So now that we have a picture of, why it's important to be teaching students a second language, let's look at a couple of trends that are currently being used kind of all across the world where languages are being taught. We'll take a look at blended learning, language immersion, and distance learning. So language immersion is an approach where you still go to a traditional classroom, but say I'm an English speaker and I'm taking a Spanish course and it's an immersive course. The idea here is that I go into that class and you're doing nothing but speaking Spanish. Even if you don't know the language, like you're pretty much going to sit there and speak Spanish and the instructor will help you through any difficulty you might have. And the focus on this type of education is largely on conversing with your classmates. So you don't do so much definitions and memorization. You're actually sitting there having a conversation. Hi, how are you today? I'm doing good. Took my dog for a walk last night. Oh, that's cool. I just, ate Taco Bell for lunch or whatever, right? So you're doing these things, but you're conversing in the language that you're trying to learn. And the idea here is basically throw you in the deep end to teach you how to swim, right? And this is largely because many linguists have found that people learn and retain language basically by conversing in it, by having normal everyday conversations, not necessarily through a bunch of memorization and definitions, right? Which has been an approach that's been used quite a lot, especially in the United States, but that's changing. We see that 448 schools are using language immersion in the United States currently. This graph here is basically showing us the growth of this approach since 1971 to 2011. And what kind of fascinates me is since 2006 to 2011, a 5-year period, we've almost doubled the number of schools using this approach. I also want to note that this approach is heavily used in many European countries as well, and it's been widely successful. So with blended learning, you take, it's like a hybrid approach where your students come into the classroom maybe like once a week or something, and then the rest of the class is delivered online. This is an increasingly popular approach because of the distance learning element, which I'll discuss on the next slide. Basically, when you go into the class, you might be thrown into an immersive environment. You might be doing a more definitive approach, right? It just depends how the school wants to teach it. But the core element here is that your students spend a lot of their time at home doing distance learning. And so this kind of approach requires some kind of software, right? It requires some kind of program to fill that void of what does the student do when they get home. The stats that you see here, I'm not going to dive into each one, but essentially what they're saying is that students overwhelmingly favor distance learning approaches. they report that they actually feel more engaged with distance learning, and they report retaining their information better, and they're less likely to actually skip out on lectures and assignments when they do distance learning. This is kind of opposite to what a lot of people think. A lot of people assume that the lack of kind of rigid structure or authority of distance learning, the sort of free will nature of it, I guess, a lot of people think that that would actually work against your academic goals, that you would actually try less or you would flake more, right, and slack off. But overwhelmingly, that's actually being found to not be true. And another important bit is that distance learning is very cheap. It's very cost effective to implement and maintain, and that's a huge draw for especially colleges right now, but K-12 as they adopt more distance learning aspects. And more about distance learning. Blended learning, basically has distance learning involved, so the two are not mutually exclusive by any means. But as far as distance learning goes, by 2019, it's expected that at least 50% of college classes are going to be delivered online. Especially, this usually happens a lot with GE courses, general ed courses. And the big reason for this, or the thing that's really driving this, is not only because of the feedback from students and well, I guess students at the college level, not parents, but not only the feedback that they like online classes more, but the fact that it's cheap. It's driving the cost of tuition down by implementing more online classes. The professors have more time to do the work they need to do. It's less like maintenance basically for them. You don't have to have a classroom full of 40 students running the heating, air conditioning, using all the electricity, all the resources of the school, all the infrastructure. Now it's just the students are at home and they connect and they do their work. It's a lot cheaper. Additionally, it also works a lot better for a lot of students, because at the college level, you have to remember a lot of students are working full time, or they might have families and other obligations. And so online classes are very attractive to those students for that reason, because they can fit it to their schedule. In the K-12 sector, and I have some stats here, you can look at them, I'm not really going to talk about them. In the public K-12 sector, we're seeing a slower adoption of distance learning, but it is expected to continue increasing. I'm not quite sure what the slow adoption is driven by. I'm assuming it's largely due to state and federal guidelines about how public schools have to teach. There's probably people who know more about that than I do, probably in this chat, to be honest, but we are still seeing that adoption though, and we're especially seeing it in private schools in K-12. There's quite a few private schools that are starting to adopt distance learning programs. I know personally, when I go to some of these educational trade shows out here on the West Coast, I talk to a lot of a lot of teachers who have Chromebook programs. And I know that's really popular right now in a lot of schools because Chromebooks are really affordable, they're portable, and pretty low maintenance. And they'll basically give them to students, for like a whole semester or a year to do like distance learning work from. And I think that's great. And I'll talk a bit about how Babbel fits in with that and why that's useful here in a moment. So now we've kind of discussed some of the trends, and I'll come back to those a little later. Let's talk about Babbel itself, which is a language learning software or program. I guess you could call it platform because you don't technically install it, you just access it. It is used in education quite heavily, and it's focused on real-life conversation skills. So kind of like I talked about with the immersive approach, Babbel focuses more on like how would you actually use the words and vocabulary and phrases you're learning, how would you actually use those in a real conversation, right? So the focus is less on saying something like, the blue dog is on top of my table, which makes no sense, right? Like, how often are you going to say that in real life? It focuses more on, hello, my name is Mark, how are you doing today? Oh, I'm doing great. Do you want to go grab a bite to eat, sort of thing. It's much more practical, real-life conversation, which helps you retain the information much better. It leverages your native language. So basically, everything's going to be taught to you from your native language. So if I'm English, the Babbel site and everything will be in English, so I can read and navigate and get to where I need to know. But the lessons themselves will still be delivered in a way that's reinforcing Spanish, right? If I'm taking Spanish, for instance. And Babbel focuses on developing all your skills. And when we say skills, we mean listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And you'll see kind of how it does this in a moment. And then there's 8,500 hours of content with 14 different languages. And to give you an idea of Babbel, I want to do a quick demonstration here. So I have the website open on my computer, and I do want to point out that this website can be accessible from any machine that has an internet browser, essentially. So your Chromebooks, this works, your Mac, your Unix system, your iPhone, Android, whatever. If it has a connection and you can get to a website, you can access the Babbel page. Or if you're on a mobile device, you can get the app. So, and the UI also looks the same across all of the different platforms, which is nice and beneficial. But when I log in, well, I'm already logged in, sorry, and I have my Spanish course selected, I basically see where I left off. It shows me, oh, you were on the second part of the beginner's course because I know nothing about Spanish. And it gives me like my score, shows me how many more lessons I can do here. But what I want to show is kind of the navigation aspect. So I can check out my courses, and what I'll see is a variety of different courses that I can interact with. So we have new courses, this is basically new content that's been created that I can look at. There's beginners courses, there's grammar courses for more focus on the grammar of the language itself. This is also useful for people who actually speak the language to help reinforce proper grammar, as per the standard dialect, essentially. And there's intermediate courses for more advanced users. There's also courses for listening and speaking, which help reinforce like your pronunciation and your understanding when people are talking to you in the language. The Spanish course also has a countries and traditions section, which focuses on kind of cultural aspects of the countries where Spanish is spoken. So these might be things like natural landmarks or governmental sort of things, or popular people from the country, things like that. And it also talks about norms and traditions, so the way that you might speak in the country versus in a different country where that language is spoken. There's also special courses here, things like idioms or practice numbers. There's also courses that focus on words and sentences. So I'm going to show you real quick just the beginner's course because that's where I'm at, and I don't want to embarrass myself too badly here. So I left off on the first beginner's course. That's what this little green dot means. So it tracks my progress, so it knows where I am at any given moment. It's tied to my account. And when I go in here, I basically get a number of lessons in here. And I think there's, for this one, it looks like there's over 20. I don't know exactly the number, but I've already done the first part, and it shows the check mark here. But maybe, I'll take a look at the second part. So I can go ahead and start this. And it's going to ask me if I want speech recognition or not. I'll go ahead and leave it on so that you can kind of see how the speech recognition works, and so I can somewhat make a fool out of myself here. When I start this lesson, what it's going to do is basically give me phrases in Spanish, and I'm going to hear somebody say that, and then I have to speak it back to them. So I'll go ahead and run into that.
Mucho gusto.
Mucho gusto.
Hasta pronto.
Hasta pronto. Hasta pronto.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes. All right. So I struggled a little on hasta pronto there, but so the idea here is what they do is they give you, first of all, the visual aid, right? So mucho gusto means it's a pleasure. And what they're showing us is pretty much like two people if they're meeting, right? So the idea is to reinforce that phrase with some kind of visual cue, which is really helpful. Same with hasta pronto, right? See you soon is like a handshake, like you're saying goodbye to somebody. And what you also noticed there was when they speak to me, they're speaking with the proper pronunciation and accent. And I want to emphasize that the people speaking are actual native speakers. This is their primary language, or their L1. And so they actually have what you would expect from a proper accent and a proper pronunciation. So the idea here is that I try to mimic that, and they try to analyze my voice and make sure that I'm, say, rolling my R's correctly, right? So I can continue, and then they reinforce these same phrases by showing me the text now. They say, what is mucho gusto? It's a pleasure, right?
Mucho gusto.
Right, I got that right. Hasta pronto is see you soon.
Hasta pronto.
Buenos días is good
Buenos
morning.
días.
and buenas tardes is good
Buenas
afternoon or evening.
tardes.
So they're trying to reinforce the reading aspect as well. And now what they do is try to reinforce the writing aspect. So they're asking me, how do I say it's a pleasure in Spanish, right? And they give you the hint, basically. I mean, you see all the words here, right? You just have to actually put them in order. Mucho gusto. And also, this is how it looks on the mobile phone. So on mobile, you just tap the letters to put them in.
Mucho gusto.
I must have typed something wrong. So then see you soon, I would do hasta pronto.
Hasta pronto.
And they keep reinforcing it with the pronunciation, right? So every time I put this in, they still have the speaker tell me, or, say the actual phrase.
Buenos días.
So that it reinforces the pronunciation. They'll also sometimes do this where they give you small cues about, I guess more specifics about the specific phrase. Buenos dias literally means good days. It's just telling you that this is actually a plural interpretation, right? And then good afternoon and evening, I can do buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
And then they'll show me, starting from noon, you say buenas tardes, then you use buenas noches when it gets dark until midnight. So there's these kind of small details that normally if you're just doing a memorization approach, you might not pick up on these, right? And then this is one of my favorite parts is they actually have pretty much like a text message conversation, right? Like you're speaking to somebody else. So they want you to fill out, how do you say good morning? Well, it's buenos dias. And they also fill out the ASCII characters.
Buenos días, Carlos.
And then, how do I say good afternoon, Jorge? I would say buenas tardes, right?
Buenas tardes, Jorge. Ya es mediodía.
And what's interesting is that they add some of this stuff in here, like ya es mediodía is something I've not learned yet in any of the lessons, but they're starting me on beginning to understand more about the language, right? So I can say, well, I know buenas tardes is good afternoon, but I don't know how to say it's already noon, but then you see this and you get an idea for that. And then they say, yes, it's late, and you are, so I say sí.
Sí, ya es tarde. ¿Y usted es?
And she's my wife, I'd say ella. These were words that I learned from the
Ella es
first
mi esposa.
Lesson. Hello, I'm Claudia, I'd say hola. Yo.
Hola, yo soy Claudia.
And this basically goes back and forth a couple more times. And I don't want to go through the whole lesson just for time purposes, but beyond this, what you'll run into is also they'll talk about, at least in Spanish, they'll talk about, say, feminine and masculine, verbs and nouns and things like that, right? And they'll give you examples of if a woman's saying this thing, what would you end this word with? If a man says this thing, what would you end the word with, right? An O or an A, aspects like that. So you still get the full comprehensive language learning there for the language you're going for. I just, for time reasons, I don't want to go through the whole lesson. So beyond that, though, I want to show you also the vocabulary section. This is basically a review section. As you go through your lessons in Babbel, it will basically save all the definitions and words that you've learned up to this point. And I can see the English translation, right? So I have yes, and then I see the Spanish translation, that's sí in Spanish, and I can also hear it.
Sí.
Or thank you is gracias.
Gracias.
Bye is ciao.
Ciao.
And so you can keep reinforcing the words that maybe you feel weak about, and you can set your own knowledge level. Say, well, I know this one really well, right? So I know what C is. I'd probably never need to study that ever again. But then maybe there's something like, let's say ella, right? Maybe I'm not so good with ella. I can set that lower, and this is just helpful for me keeping track of my own progress and measuring my learning. You can also review all of these words. So I can say review these items, and I have several options. I can try and reinforce my reading and writing using the writing aspect, or I can try and reinforce my listening and speaking using speech. Additionally, I can use flashcards for a more memorization approach. And you've already seen the writing, reading in the lesson, and you've already kind of seen the pronunciation aspect. So I'll click on the flashcards, and this is basically what you think it is, right? They show you an image. They say, what is the word in English? It's yes. I know that is sí in Spanish, so I click the question marks. It's sí, and I'm like, okay, well, I got that right. So I hit yes. Thank you is gracias.
Gracias.
Bye is ciao.
Chao.
He is él.
Él.
I don't say it right, but you know. You is tú.
Tú.
She is ella.
Ella.
Again, I don't say it right. Hello is hola.
Hola.
I is
Yo.
yo. And that's all I have for now. I only have those 8 words because I haven't gone through a whole lot of lessons yet. Shows me what I got right, what I didn't get right. And so you can kind of basically see where you're at by reviewing all this information. And it helps reinforce your knowledge of the definitions, vocabulary, and everything like that, as well as the pronunciation. So that's all I'm going to look at for the actual platform for now. Again, as you go through the courses, they do get more involved and more in depth than just what you saw here, but for time reasons, I don't want to dive too far into that. So I'll go ahead and hop back into a presentation. And all right. So as you saw there, the way Babbel basically gets you to mastery is that they have courses designed for every level. So you can start with the beginner courses if you don't know anything about the language, or maybe you're an intermediate, you can start there. Maybe you actually are a speaker, like you know the language, but you want to reinforce your grammar. There's grammar courses for that. So for every step of the way, even for the person who can speak the language, there's something to be taken from here. At the beginning, when you first use Babbel, it will basically test you on your knowledge. It will say how it basically gives you questions to gauge how knowledgeable or how fluent you are with the language. Once they do that test, they take the results and they'll basically suggest where you should start. You don't have to follow that path, but it's helpful in identifying basically where you're at and setting a pathway for you to just follow along with. So when I did mine, I obviously got thrown into the beginner section because I know very little Spanish. So the reason Babbel's effective, and I kind of discussed this a little bit earlier, is one of the large parts is the interactive dialogue. The fact that you're actually getting relevant content, right? You're getting words and phrases that you use every day, and you're applying them in the lessons in a way that makes sense. Again, to use my earlier example, you're not saying the blue dog is on top of the table, right? Like, for one, how many blue dogs are there? Why would the dog be on top of the table? That rarely ever happens in real life. And so it's kind of not a very real world example. So Babbel tries to focus on those real world examples and conversation pieces that you might actually have if you were to go speak to your friend who speaks the language, or if you were to go to the country and speak, right? The lessons are voiced by native speakers, as I said when I was doing the demo. So this is really helpful for your pronunciation and helping you to understand how to listen to the native speaker, as well as how you should be pronunciating your words, and how you can try and basically morph your accent to be closer to the standard dialect. Speech recognition technology basically helps you to do this, and they will analyze those accental features, right? Because they're going to be comparing your voice with that of the native speaker, and if it's not matching to a certain percentage, they're basically not going to let you pass, right? So when I was doing the demo, I had to do hasta pronto twice because it didn't like the first way I did it. The review sessions and that vocabulary tab, those are effective because that's the aspect that helps you reinforce maybe your weak points, right? So in Spanish, I'm really bad with nosotros and usted. I struggle oftentimes to remember what the differences between the two are. And so for me, if I was to review my vocabulary in Spanish, those would be the two I would really focus on, right? And so I could go back in there and say, I'm going to flashcard these, or I'm going to go through the speaking and pronunciation aspect, or maybe I'm just going to do the reading and writing. Whatever I feel helps me learn the best, I can do that. Every lesson is only 10 to 15 minutes, and this is an important point because study after study by many linguists and psychologists have basically found that you only need a maximum of 45 minutes a day to learn a new language, or given enough time. And you actually learn best through short lessons, short bursts, right? They actually generally recommend that you do 15 minutes and you step away for like 5 or 10 minutes and then you do another one, right? So the idea here is that all these lessons are catered to that research. All these lessons are catered to the way that your mind interprets language and adapts to it. So this is also beneficial because 15 minutes at max is not a huge time commitment for people with busy schedules. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this content is all relevant. We're using real life, actual conversations and things like that. We're not just using random definitions thrown together for the sake of definitions. And also Babbel's portable. And so we say it's available anytime, anywhere, right? This is really important because a lot of language learning software is actually like localized on your machine. And so if you have it on your like PC at home, you can't necessarily take that to the office with you, right? I mean, you could take your laptop, but with Babbel, you can access it from your phone, from your Chromebook, from your MacBook. Like, you could probably get it on your smart TV. I don't know. I haven't tried, but I would assume that as long as you have a browser, you can connect to the website, you can access it. So it's highly portable, anytime, anywhere, and that's a really big deal for schools where all of your students might have different devices that they access content with. You need to be able to have that portability because you don't want to limit the student who has a MacBook who can't run the software, right? Like, you want them to be able to have that same opportunity that the Windows user does, that the Chromebook user does, and Babbel's perfect for that. So why educators choose Babbel? For one, it's really easy to use, but probably the biggest fact is that it's affordable. Schools increasingly at the college level, they're trying to look how can they cut down on the cost of tuition for students. At the K-12 level, they're just looking at how can I get anything with the limited budget and the shrinking budget that I'm getting, right? Especially because language learning I don't believe it gets as much, say, federal money or state money as, say, STEM programs do. So there's a lot of penny pinching that has to go into developing a comprehensive language program, and so you need affordable solutions to be able to do that, and Babbel is precisely affordable, and that's why it's a great fit for so many schools. And some people might be wondering, well, why wouldn't I just use free software, right? There's a lot of free apps and stuff on the phones. I've used many of them and I've seen how they work. There's multiple points to be made here about the downside of the free software. A big one is the ads, right? You have no control over the ads that are being targeted at whatever network you're sitting on. So say you're at school and you're doing a lesson, you really have no control over that ad that shows up. It could be wildly inappropriate. We don't know. And in the public K-12 system, that's completely unacceptable, right? That's like a lawsuit waiting to happen. So you don't want that to happen to you. Babbel has no such ads like that because it is a paid-for platform. Additionally, a lot of the free programs provide user-curated content. And what that means is that the content itself is created by the users. It's not created, there's really no quality control. Like, there's some level of control of, like, obviously they don't want some majorly inappropriate stuff to show up on the app, but in general, there's no control over the effectiveness of the content that you're learning. There's no control over, like, who's actually providing this content. It could be a 12-year-old with a loose grasp of the grammar, you have no idea. But with Babbel, they actually have language professionals, they have linguists, they have people who have studied this, and they know the effective solutions. They know how to implement this material in a way that you're going to remember it and retain it. And you just don't get that with the free apps. And probably the biggest beef I have with the free apps is the in-app purchases, because there's an app I've used, I won't name it, but you basically have 5 lives, right? And if you miss a question, you lose a life. And if you get to 0 lives, you basically can't go on. Like, you can't keep learning. Like, they literally put you behind a paywall to actually keep learning the content. And this is really common with a lot of the free apps because they have to make money somehow. And so what they then do is they say, oh, if you want to pay us, $1, we'll give you back 5 lives right now. Otherwise, you have to wait an hour and a half to get a life back, right? And so that just doesn't mesh with an educational environment where you have students who are going to miss a lot of questions. It's just how it is, right? And with a free app, they're basically being punished for it, and they're being prevented from continuing their education because they missed 5 questions, right? It's a bit ridiculous, and a lot of the free apps have such schemes involved, and Babbel doesn't do anything like that. Again, educators also choose it because of the portability aspect. Your progress is synced across all your devices. So if I were to go on my iPhone right now, I would still be at the same spot that I just left off on my demo, right? And probably the big thing about why you use Babbel in the classroom is because it supports all the current language trends that I talked about earlier. With immersive learning, for instance, you may not necessarily use the software in the class as much, but you do have to consider as an instructor, like, how do you ensure that your students go home and that they're using the language? Because the immersive environment really relies on your students being surrounded by the language and consistently using it. And so if you're to give them a homework assignment, you need to give them something that they can do. And with Babbel, you say, okay, go home, do 2 15-minute lessons, and you'll report to me on your progress, basically. And another big part of immersive learning is to help students learn about the culture of that country or of the speakers of that language. And Babbel does provide cultural courses that kind of focus on that. And so it's also a great fit for that aspect of it, helping to teach about the culture. In the blended learning environments, language software is basically essential, and Babbel's ideal because of the cost effectiveness of it. It doesn't cost you much at all to implement that for your students, or for your students to, say, at the college level, for your students to purchase the software themselves. But with a blended learning environment, you have to have some kind of software, essentially. If you're going to send the students home and they got to do their class online, it's great to have software that can basically track their progress and allow you, the instructor, to see what they're doing, and understand where they're at. So kind of closing this out here, for the people who are attending today, we do have an offer to give you a free personal copy of the software that is good for 6 months, a 6-month license. To my knowledge, this is a full-featured license. There's no restrictions about it except that it's personal use, so you can't, say, use it in the classroom or outside, say, commercial work, things like that. Basically, to do this, what you'll want to do is look at these instructions down here. Email marketing@studica.com. In the subject line, put BAB free, all caps, and we will provide you with information on how to do this. Again, you email marketing@studica.com, use BAB free as your subject line. We'll provide you with instructions about this. So yeah, that's only for those of you who actually attended today. So it's kind of a thank you for showing up, hearing what we have to say. And be sure that if you're interested in this, be sure to write these instructions down or go ahead and do it right now. And this is just to hopefully, so you can see if you like the software, if you think it's going to work for you, and see how easy and everything it is to use. All right, so with that being said, I will open it up to questions. If you have questions, I don't want to open the mic set because there's a number of people in here and we're going to get a lot of feedback. There's a chat option at the top of the Join Me window. There's a little chat bubble icon. You can click on that and basically ask a question of us in the chat here. So if you have any questions about the product, or I don't know, really anything about what you just heard, please do let me know, and I will leave this open for a couple minutes here and see what I get in the chat menu. So can you study more than one language at a time? I think somebody had answered that earlier in the chat. I'm trying to read through what people were saying while I was talking. Jennifer says one language at a time. Jennifer is a sales rep with our company. Which languages are covered? 14 languages. Let me look at the website real quick because I have them all listed here. Let's see, we have Dutch, French, Danish, English, German, Indonesian, Italian, Norwegian, Polish, Portuguese, Russia, Swedish, Turkish, and they're still working on more languages. They're always working on more languages, so their content is expanding as we go along here. So again, that's what you see on my screen here is where the offerings are right now. Christy, what do you mean by reporting? Do you want me to talk about reporting tools? Or is that a question somebody had? Yeah, so for the reporting tools, to my understanding is that they're currently working on it and are expected to release that relatively soon here. That's what we have heard. And I believe they're actually at the point of basically fine-tuning it, like fixing the bugs and everything to get it pushed out. I don't know specifically about that, but that might be something you'll want to follow up with us in an email, and somebody more knowledgeable than I might be able to address that question better. Yeah, Jennifer knows a lot about this. She says learning platforms in the works. Any other questions that I might have missed, Christy, or anybody else for that matter? Okay. Give it like another 30 seconds or so in case someone's typing. Thank you, viewer 8. Feel weird calling you viewer 8. All right, well, it doesn't look like I'm getting more questions for now, so I'll leave that with some more information here. So if you want to see on our website kind of what offerings we have for Babbel, kind of see how affordable it is and everything, just go to Studica.com. That's our URL. Or you can just Google Studica Babbel. You should find us on the first link. If you have questions that maybe I couldn't answer here or that I didn't address in the presentation, you can also email us at sales@studica.com. Our sales team is really knowledgeable about this, probably more knowledgeable than I am in a lot of aspects here. They can definitely help you answer any questions you might have about this program or about implementing it. We also have an 800 number, 888-561-7521. We're available Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, that's Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and you can call us and somebody will be able to help you answer any questions you might have. And lastly, I do want to tell you that we will be sending a follow-up email that will contain a recording of this webinar, so if you want to review any information, and we'll also have further information in that email about the program and everything else that we went over today. So with that, I want to thank everybody for coming, and I hope you all have a great day and a great week. And thank you. Have a good one.